Welcome to Questions and Answers with Dr. Michael Brown. I'm Dr. Scott Stewart. I'm your host, the pastor of Agape Church. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Brown with us. We've had a wonderful weekend of meetings, and we thought we might be able to answer a few questions that have come into us over the past few months and things that have been asked of me. So we'll jump right into it. Dr. Brown,
great
welcome.
to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Last time we were together, you had written a great book, Hyper Grace. And how was that received nationwide?
It was received very well.
Yeah.
It's been read and commented on really as much as any book I've written in terms of getting attention. It's been translated into quite a few languages very quickly. In fact, I came back from an overseas trip. I had been in Italy and in Holland, and in each country they handed me a translation of the book. When I got home, there was a package on my desk I wasn't even expecting. I opened it up and it was translated into Finnish. So
That's great.
It's bad news and good news in that there was a need for it in many
Yeah.
different places. But yes, it seems to have really met a need, and it seems to have strongly addressed something, and the Lord's grace was on it to get the message out.
And so obviously the book is written to kind of help put some parameters and things like that. Do you feel that the hyper grace movement has kind of been corralled a little bit, or is it still?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Some of the extremism I don't hear as much. Some have said, no, you misunderstood us, so this is not really what we're saying. And I knew when I wrote the book that to some people I was going to be the bad guy.
Right.
But I thought, I don't mind that if the end result is good.
Right.
In other words, if they say, no, I didn't say that, or you quoted me out of context, or it's not what I meant, well, just go ahead and correct it. Even if I did quote you accurately and you want to blame me, that's fine. So I believe on some level it has been effective in that regard. I'll say this, for a solid year, as I traveled, as soon as I'd sit down with a pastor or leader of the congregation, the first thing out of their mouth would be hyper grace. Wow. And this is tearing up our church, or this is dividing our community, or this is hurting our family. So even in social media, I've seen much, much less pushback.
Right.
So it seems a few things have happened. On the one hand, some have clarified and have recognized there were some unhealthy extremes, and they've pulled back a little. Some even contacted me privately and said, okay, I've pulled back.
And I'll confirm that because I've heard some actually begin to modify what they're saying, which I think is in part what you've done.
And then I've seen others go to even further extremes, which we knew would happen. Yeah. But that's also further disqualified them because they're so far out that very few people are listening to them. And then there are those that would be the better known names associated with hyper grace that are still preaching it, but as I said, either in a more nuanced way or maybe adding a little to the message to say, no, this is not what we believe, or we've been lumped together with others who believe certain things. So from my perception, the epidemic has been checked, and things are in better shape now than they were when we did the interview.
Excellent. And so I know you met with some leaders that were really proposing this and pushing this forward. Did you find them to be receptive to you, and were they, accommodating in some way?
I wrote to a number of leaders with whom I was going to interact in my book before I wrote the book. Right. And I said, hey, I'm going to be interacting with you in the book, and I'd like you to see what I'm writing, and would you retract any of your views? Or most of them were very gracious and said, sorry, thanks but no thanks kind of thing, or this is what we believe and we hold to it. But most were very friendly and said, if you want to quote extra, you have our permission to quote extra, that's no problem. One was nasty, threatened to sue me, put out a nasty video. It's like, what can I do? Bless you and go on. Yeah. But I did meet for 2 hours. This is the one serious face-to-face meeting. I met for 2 hours with Joseph Prince in Singapore a couple years ago, maybe going on 3 years ago now. And I apologized to him because I did not reach out to him first for a couple of reasons. One, I thought, he's in Singapore, a mega church pastor. I have no real connection to him, and I'm not going to get through to him. And then another thing was that I knew a leader that spent 5 hours with him and went back and forth, and neither moved an inch. So I thought he's been through this. Right. So I apologized to him for not reaching out first, and he graciously received the apology, forgave me for that, and was willing to meet. And his issue was that while I quoted him accurately in my book, he felt that he was associated with other people whose ideas he differed with. For example, Pastor Clark Whitten, that I quote at the outset, says that if you say that sanctification is progressive, that you grow in holiness, it is, quote, a spiritually murderous lie. Right. And many in the hyper grace camp hold to that very dangerous theology, that if you say you grow in holiness, that's a spiritually murderous lie. That what they're teaching is the dangerous lie.
Right.
Joseph Prince does believe in progressive sanctification.
I see.
He says you can become more holy, you can't become more righteous. So more righteous is a standing in God, legal standing, right? But you can grow in holiness. So that was important to know. We had some really good fellowship. We had clear differences on interpretation of verses. Joseph Prince is convinced that if people hear his message, it'll produce holiness of heart, holiness of life. And those who are using it as an excuse for sin are not really hearing him. I said, I am hearing people that follow you regularly, and they take it as a license for sin. Right. And he's saying, well, they're not hearing me rightly. So, we had some strong differences. Right. But he had written an article on counterfeit holiness for a book collection that I was going to be in as well about grace, hyper grace. And he said, why don't we major on that? So I wrote out a statement, sent it to him. We went back and forth on it in terms of what we feel are serious dangers in a counterfeit grace message. Counterfeit grace, not counterfeit holiness. So a counterfeit grace message. We agreed on all those points and issued a statement together saying we still have strong areas of disagreement on other points, but we recognize one another as brothers. So he got in trouble for doing that with me. I got in trouble for doing it with him. Yeah. But I felt that we could use our joint platforms and our joint voice to say, here's what we strongly warn against together. Right. And we both say that the real gospel and real grace leads to holiness of heart and life. Right. And I said to him, hey, let me just always be in the back of your head when you're preaching, just to get that extra. So I don't know, I haven't followed his teaching and preaching since then, but the meeting itself was very positive for sure. And what we issued out, the warning about counterfeit grace, that was very positive. Right. But the differences that we have on interpretation of specific verses and concepts, we still have those. Right.
And on the other side of the water here in the U.S., we have the issues related to Andy Stanley. Would you think he would be? I know you interviewed him. Would he be considered the same type of hyper grace, or would he be?
No, there's a different theology with Andy Stanley. Again, a key root of the hyper grace teaching is the moment you're saved, God pronounces your future sins forgiven. Right. Therefore, you don't have to confess your sins. Therefore, the Holy Spirit doesn't convict you of sin. Yep. Therefore, you can't grow in holiness. I mean, some would come to that conclusion as well.
And even within hyper grace, it seems they also buy into hyper dispensationalism as well, because it's almost like they want to cut off the words of Jesus altogether, remove the Gospels, make his words kind of old covenant, as it were, and not have anything to do with them. Going back to Prince, did you guys talk about the words of Jesus at all in that
He
respect?
was much more affirming of the words of Jesus when we talked and understood how certain things could be taken in a different way. But it's not for me to issue a statement as to his beliefs based on my understanding of our conversation. It's up to him to put it in writing or in teaching. So I don't know if he's changed that view or backed away from it or said all the words of Jesus for us, they just have to be rightly applied. I'm honestly not sure. Right. But I do want to say this. I've also seen an increase in the preaching of grace in a healthy way. In other words, while hyper grace swung too far, it did tell people that many are caught up in legalism. When I would begin to teach on hyper grace, I was, well, I need to teach on grace more. Yeah. And I need to make sure people are grounded. Joseph Prince asked me about my own walk with God. And I said, I walk in a sense of the Father's love 24/7 and never, ever, ever feel condemned. Right. And he said, do you think most believers are like that? I said, oh, absolutely not. That's where you got to keep teaching about the Father's love and grace. Sure. So in that sense, even though hyper grace swung way too far, it awakened many others to realize how many believers struggle with self-condemnation, how many believers feel like God's not happy with them all the time, feel beaten down. So hopefully more pastors, preachers, leaders are preaching a healthy grace message as a result. Right. As for Andy Stanley, he and I dialogued about his unhitched comment, that we have to unhitch from the Old Testament, which then he said on my radio show, he should have found a better way to say that. But when we had a great discussion, he said, look, I want people to come to Jesus. He said, I'm thinking of a 15-year-old, they're out there. They think the Bible's some bad book and, Bronze Age God and it's anti-gay and whatever. He said, I want them to come to Jesus. And I want to preach Jesus and the resurrection. When they come to Jesus, then I'm going to tell them, hey, this was his book. This was, so get them from that door over to here. But we still had some differences in perception. Right. For example, I said to him, when you build the first story of the house, you don't knock out the first story and build the second. Right? So you build the first, finish the second, you don't knock out the first. Right. Well, in his mind, the Old Testament is the basement and the New Testament is the first floor. I see. In my view, the New Testament is the first floor, the Old Testament is the first floor, and New Testament is the second floor. Right. That's a pretty big difference. Huge. Yeah. So we had great interaction. We had interaction subsequently. He emphasized how much he loves the Old Testament, preaches out of it, believes in it, holds to the authority of Scripture and all of that. This is an apologetic thing to try to get people in through this door. But when I started reading his book, Irresistible, I was really troubled by it. Yeah. And I told him, listen, I'm going to write a book called Why Andy Stanley's Irresistible Must Be Resisted. And then we can have a point of contact and back and forth. I just never gotten around to it. I haven't even finished the book. All right. But there were things in the book that struck me as extreme statements, struck me as really undercutting Jewish roots of the faith, not understanding how certain of these things fell into place. So he's tremendously influential, clearly loves Jesus and wants to see people come to know the Lord, is an Orthodox believer in all these ways. And I appreciate he's tremendously humble and open and accessible, which is extraordinary for a leader of his stature. Sure. And yet I have some very serious concerns for that very reason, because he influences so many. Right. And there is to me, it's a denigrating of the role of the Old Testament overall. For sure.
Let's shift gears a little bit and go into our millennials that we have right now and the seemingly rise of kind of what we would call kind of the new Calvinism. Why do you think that would be happening? If there's a way that we could approach that, why do you think that our millennials might be moving towards Calvinism?
Right. I think there are good reasons and bad reasons. I also think that it may be waning a little. Now, maybe it's just my perception, but it seemed to be more trendy a little while ago, and then you had some kind of drifting in and drifting out, and some of the real Orthodox Calvinists said you were never really among us. You never really got the whole thing, Right. But I think on the one hand, Calvinism offers a certain grounding to them with its emphasis on the sovereignty of God and its emphasis on serious theology. So if you want to dig deeper and you want to go further, it's often presented as, the orthodoxy or kind of the more enlightened view. Right. And maybe it brings a certain sense of stability. And to me, I see the larger rise of Calvinism, again, the pendulum swinging, that the American gospel, in so many of our circles, especially charismatic, has become so man-centered, me-centered. And then in some of our faith circles, you have God over here, Satan over here, and we cast the deciding vote. Right. So there's very little view of God on the throne and ruling and reigning. And it's so me-centered that as they're reacting against a me-centered mindset in the church and among the younger people, they're going to swing over to a more God-centered. To me, they swing too far. Right. And that's where they embrace Calvinism. Right. I think in a lot of our churches, because we haven't taught Scripture deeply enough, and we're not theologically grounded enough, when people want to get more theological as Protestants, as evangelicals, that seems to be the way to go. That's the theologically sound and the smart people and the educated people, the scholars, this is what they believe. That's what I did the late 70s, early 80s. I thought I had now taken on the more intellectually sound position that great church leaders had held to through the centuries. That was kind of my perception, although I also believed it was scriptural during that time. But I don't see it as all bad in that, as I said, some are just digging deeper into theology, and some are swinging away from the me-centered message. Right. I just said, let the pendulum swing back where we emphasize the sovereignty of God and His goodness, but don't embrace all the tenets of Calvinism.
Right. So you think in part it's because the charismatic world has not been balanced enough with sovereignty and so forth, and just emphasized too much of kind of the man-centered decision-making in it?
Yeah, so the theology, as I said, of God here, Satan here, and I cast the deciding vote, and the theology of Jesus died to make me into a bigger and better me.
Right.
And that's, that he's here to make my dreams come true. So they react against that and they swing this other direction. But look, I've also seen some charismatics end up going into a liturgical expression.
Yeah.
And the leaders are going to have robes and have special titles. And,
is this in order to reach the millennials? Is that what they're doing?
No,
no.
Because I saw this before we had the real rise of millennials. To me, what it was is simple. And the New Testament's not a big book. Right, so if you're a religious Jew, you have the Old Testament, which is bigger, but that's the tiny fragment of what you look at. You're looking at all rabbinic literature, which is this massive sea of volume after volume after volume. If you're a traditional Catholic, you have all of Catholic tradition and the Catholic liturgy, and then all the holy days and seasons and this and that. If you just have the New Testament, and you're not really digging deeply, I mean, new and old, right? But you're not really digging into the meat of the word.
Right.
And you're not experiencing the life and power of the Spirit. It's like, what do you have?
Yeah.
You don't have the liturgy. You don't have all the history and the tradition, the pomp and the circumstance. So I see these things as trying to fill in for the lack of encounter with the Spirit, because when you are deeply encountering the Spirit and digging into the Word, you're satisfied.
Yes.
And you can raise your family in that, and there is a healthy lifestyle that comes out of it, and they encounter God for themselves and can pass it on to the next generations.
Right.
So I think sometimes we're trying to fill a void, and people fill it in wrong ways.
Right.
So I'm not equating Calvinism, say, with liturgy necessarily, or wearing robes and titles. They may relate, they may be totally different. But I think there are reasons, if you look for a spiritual, sociological explanation, I think they're readily found.
Right. Well, with that being said, then we have this other ditch on this side that shows a rise of people subscribing to witchcraft or becoming witches, predominantly within the millennial camp. What do you think would attribute the rise of witchery in America?
Yeah, so a few things. Again, one, the recognition that there's more.
Right.
There's more than just the physical life and the material world. And they recognize that. So because they've rejected God, or what they had was kind of a wishy-washy Christianity, they got inoculated to that. So they're not even going to look there. So they look in these esoteric other areas. It's one thing. Another thing is the popularization of this through Harry Potter novels, through vampire movies.
Right.
That it's just something you grow up with.
Right.
And there's such an inundation of it, so many of the movies. And look, if I was a little kid watching a Harry Potter movie, I remember watching one flying overseas one time. I thought, okay, this is going to be fine to watch because it's not going to have profanity or nudity or, and I'm not going to be affected by it, right? So I can just watch it, right? I thought if I was a kid, I'd get one of those wands. I'd be trying to say formulas. I'd be trying to find some magic powers.
Right.
And again, to me, it's people recognizing there's more, but it's the enemy of our souls kind of hijacking the moment, right? So, you have from the Harry Potter to you have an increase in Ouija boards, tarot cards. So when people reject the light, they go the way of darkness. It's just a natural thing that's going to happen. And when they're not experiencing the reality of God, they're going to look for some supernatural experience somewhere else.
And you think it's because they're not experiencing the supernatural in church, or is it just a deep innate hunger that people have for the supernatural? I mean, these numbers are pretty dramatic. I think you even mentioned on Sunday that now there's more that are professing witches than there are Presbyterians.
Yeah, especially among millennials.
I mean, this is it would be the antithesis of a Calvinist viewpoint. I mean, the Calvinists would downplay all the supernatural, yet at the same time we have this swing among the millennials towards the supernatural world.
Yeah, look, think back to the 60s. So I was in the whole drug rock culture then, so sex, drugs, rock and roll, Eastern religion. There was a searching for the meaning of life. There were people saying there must be more than just getting a good education to get a good job, so I can get my kids a good education to get a good job. People dying in the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassinations, King, and then another Kennedy assassination. There's a lot of instability in the society.
Sure.
People looking for more. So they find it in sinful fleshly expressions, in rebellion. But that's why so many also got saved, because they were looking for more.
Right.
And when they heard the real gospel, they turned.
Weren't a lot of Jewish people drawn into the New Age and that type of thing at that time as well?
Look, the leader of Hare Krishna sect came over, it was a Sanskrit scholar, came over to America, felt this divine mandate to come and teach Christian consciousness, bases himself in New York City in the late 60s. And one of their leaders told me years ago that at the height of the movement, 75% of the world leaders of Hare Krishna were Jewish.
Really?
You had Jew-boos, that phenomenon, so many Jews converting to Buddhism. The largest number of Jewish converts to Buddhism in the West, largest number of converts to Buddhism in the West were Jews.
And it was during the 60s?
Yeah, 60s, early 70s. Yeah. So you had this phenomenon of so many Jews at the front of looking, searching. The counterculture revolutionaries, the Allen Ginsbergs and Jerry Rubins and Abby Hoffmans and these different people, members of Jefferson Airplane were Jews. There were a lot that were. And they were part of this search for more. But here's what's interesting among the Jewish people, and I'll come back to the millennials, that you have, to this day, a disproportionate number of Jews who are into occult or New Age things or cults or things like that, disproportionately high number. And a disproportionately high number of atheists. So you have this looking for God in the wrong places, and then you have this complete rejection of God because of this God calling, and you can go one of two ways with it. So when you come back to the millennials, I think there are a few things. On the one hand, there is this longing for something deeper and an intellectual soundness and a rootedness, and they may find that in Calvinism. Then on the other side, there's a recognition, a lot of these people are not churched at all, that there's more, and they're looking for more, but they choose darkness rather than light, so they go the way of witchcraft. And Satan has a plan. If Satan sees there's a void in the society, like in the 60s, he's often way ahead of the church and capitalizing on it. So he comes swooping in here with all these alternative things. And hey, to be a witch, you don't have to deny yourself.
Of course.
And to get into occult powers, you can still sleep with your girlfriend, and you can get high and experience insight and revelation. So the flesh gravitates in that way. But we've got to open our eyes. Look, October 25th of this year, 2019, the New York Times has an article, "When did everyone become a witch?" And it says we've reached peak witch. That to me is also part of a larger cultural issue that I write about in my Jezebel book, Jezebel's War with America, the rise of radical feminism, the Shout Your Abortion movement, the sexual seduction of America through porn, the emasculating of men, the attack on gender. All these things are really related, and many of the feminist groups have deep ties to witchcraft and talk about finding the witch in each of you. So there's this cultural shift away from biblical foundations, and this is part of the supernatural expression of it.
Is most of this pursuit in witchcraft, is it kind of packaged as white witchcraft, as a benign type thing, or is it packaged more as hexes and the green face and the black cat and the cauldron type thing?
You find both.
Do you?
Many, look, there's some that claim to be Christian witches. I've even seen that phenomenon now. But they would say it's good. Even they're hexes. They wanted to put a binding spell on President Trump to stop him from doing harm, So they think they're doing good. But there are many others that are much more overt, much darker, much more on the explicit satanic side.
So would there be more of a pull towards the dark side than the light side? Is there a way that we know which way it's going? And
obviously, you really have to know what's happening demographically, and I don't know that those answers are available. I certainly don't have them. I know the general face that's put forward, the most popular face is positive witchcraft, good witchcraft, and so on. But when you look at the ideological values and beliefs of those, they're overwhelmingly going to be pro-abortion. They go overwhelmingly pro-gay activist, overwhelmingly against biblical values. So it's seems more innocent in its packaging, but it's still looking to supernatural power, and it's obviously not God's side. But there are definitely those with clear evil intentions, and the dark side is probably going to have a more concerted but quiet following because of things being done more in hiding, more in the dark. That's my impression anyway. But look, when you have women and these witches not just hexing the president, but hexing the patriarchy.
Right.
That's why you can't deny the connection between that and radical feminism.
Right. And do you feel that there's been, without being conspiratorial, do you feel that just the enemy has, throughout decades now, used entertainment to get us conditioned to, like you said, vampires, or conditioned to the supernatural in a negative way, as far as the dark side, that people have become just more used to it and more accepting of it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's entertainment follow culture, culture follow entertainment. There's obviously a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. And one thing shifts the other, then the other goes more extreme.
Right.
And I am totally conspiratorial when it comes to Satan. In other words, I believe Satan is working behind the scenes in concerted ways.
Right.
As far as a lot of the other conspiracies and the Illuminati and that kind of thing, I'm very skeptical of a lot of it. But does Satan have plans and designs? Yes. And certainly we know for a fact that with certain ideologies, let's say gay activists, mm-hmm. We know for a fact from their own mouths, from gay screenwriters and producers and things, that they had an agenda to normalize certain things, to put more gay characters in front of people, to make certain things seem more acceptable. There's no question that a lot of them had issues with religion, and the Catholic priest is an evil guy, and, and any ex-gay is a fake, and so on. So you're just going to see these themes weaved in. I have a whole chapter in The Queer Thing Happened to America, where I show through sitcom after sitcom and drama show after, and the movie, we're all with the same message and the same talking points. Right. So there's no question that people had an agenda, just like, for those who think, how can you say that? Don't Christian movie producers and Christian screenwriters have an agenda?
Absolutely.
Of course. And aren't we trying to get through the Unplanned movie, or through the Breakthrough movie, or through, the War Room, whatever, trying to get a message out and get a mind? Yeah, so why should it surprise us that those with different ideologies do? Yeah. But look, you go back to the 60s and Rosemary's Baby. And those kinds of things. I never saw the movie, but found out what it was about, right? Yeah. But you've got one thing after another where seeds are being sown. Yeah. Look, there's no question. If young people are exposed to sex scenes all the time, that it's going to titillate their interest, and that some are going to get more sexually involved earlier than others. Mm-hmm. And if you see constant gay sex scenes, it's going to desensitize you to it. It may seem repulsive initially, then you get used to it. Right. So, of course, those that make their money through this, those that make their money through porn, they want more people into porn and more people addicted to porn. There's nothing altruistic in what they're doing. They want to get rich and control people's lives through it. So none of this surprises me. I asked Winky Pratney once, I said, why the fascination with vampires? He said, power of the blood and eternal life. So Satan's version of a gospel truth. And I read the original Dracula book, and it's the power of the cross. I mean, that this evil power is defeated by the cross. And then it becomes instead that Dracula is the hero. Dracula is now the vampires are and you've got the trilogies and the love stories and all this. So there's no question that there are people with demonic agendas wanting to get this out. Some may think it's harmless. Others may think, hey, it's like Chronicles of Narnia, and we're just getting out a message with good moral values through Harry Potter and stuff like that. But when you dig deeper and you see where it goes, someone said to me, go down to Walt Disney Center in Florida, Epcot Center, whatever it's called, Disneyland, and go to the Harry Potter exhibit. And you watch the kids leaving there with their robes, with their wands, casting spells. You see how much they get interested in the whole deal. Wow. So that would seem more innocent and benign, but it's all going in this direction, away from the truth of Scripture. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that from my read of things through history, when the church is really non-supernatural, that Satan's efforts go in the same way. In other words, he doesn't come out with as many counterfeit miracles and counterfeit experiences because the other side doesn't believe in them, and also he'll just go the way of a godless intellectualism or the appeal to the flesh and the world. But it seems the more the church recovers the things of the power of the Spirit, then he has to come up with his counterfeit. Right. So the more I see the counterfeit, the more I grieve over that, but then I'm encouraged that God's doing something over here. Oh,
fantastic. Anyway, I rejoice in that, and I hold with you on that one. With all that being said, we have seen a general decline in the interest of God in our society, a decline in church attendance, for example. To where it was back in 37 to 76, it was like 70%, then just a small fall to 68% in the 70s, up to the 90s. But then for the past 20 years, we've had like a 20% drop. It's been dramatic. Would you say that's primarily in our younger people? Or, I mean, I'm a Generation X guy, and I think that we've had a drop in the Xers as well. Would there be, I lived in Europe for 27 years, and you could chart what happens with these nations and they all at one time were great, strong, God-loving, God-fearing nations. And as the population began to become more secular, then everything began to erode. Is that what's happening to us? Or
partly, yes. I think there are a few dynamics to all of it. The most pronounced group dropping out of church is millennials, for sure.
Right.
And if you just look in general belief systems and social values, you'll see the biggest differences with millennials as compared to older generation. It's quite stark. Mm-hmm. And I know it's not completely atypical in that young people would have values a little bit different than older people.
Right.
The old joke, which of course is exaggerated, but if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. And if you're not conservative when you're old, you don't have a mind.
Right.
Right. So again, it's an exaggerated statement, but things are going to shift and become more conservative as people get older and raise families. Right. and live life out. That being said, yeah, there is a drop for sure. Some of the drop, though, is people who are nominal Christians just don't go to church anymore.
Right.
And they no longer identify as Christian. So if you will see the denominations that are bleeding the most, it's the liberal ones. It is the so-called progressive. They keep telling us you have to be like the world to win the world. And we say, if you become like the world to win the world, you have nothing to win the world to.
Right.
And Wolfhard Pannenberg, a German theologian, said that when people are looking for religion, they're looking for something other. And if religion is just like the world, they're not gonna make a commitment.
Right.
So you will see the denominations that are bleeding members the most rapidly are the most liberal across the board. And on the same level, I see everywhere I go in America where Jesus is really being preached and exalted in the life and power of the Spirit, people are flocking. Yeah. Congregations are growing. Young people are coming. Mm-hmm. There's great appeal for a deeper commitment in prayer and fasting. So I know there's been some drop-off, but I think it's a little bit exaggerated in that a lot of it is the drop-off of those who were nominal before. They now identify as religious nuns, right. N-O-N-E-S. At the same time, the American church, especially white evangelical church, has been perceived as kind of an appendage of the Republican Party. And through satanically wise strategies, we have been painted as if we're all bigoted and hateful. And just the gay issues, like why are you so mean to gays and things like that. So some have dropped out because they have a negative reaction to the stance of the church. Mm-hmm. But others have dropped out because they have questions and leaders don't give them an environment where they can ask questions.
Right.
I think it's a good time now to examine who we are, what we do.
Right.
But aside from having an environment where anyone can come, whoever they are, and they know when they walk in those doors, they're going to be loved when they first come in, and having an environment where it's perfectly fine to ask questions and there's no problem with it, and we welcome that. Excellent. Yeah. Let's study that together. Aside from that, I think the biggest thing we need to do is really be more of who we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Not water things down, not change the message, but get back to the basics.
Right.
Pray and fast and cry out to the Lord and preach the gospel and preach the cross and preach the blood and preach the resurrection and lay hands on the sick. Mm-hmm. And if we do that, I believe young people will come flocking.
Because it's been very much in vogue to, especially what we would call like a seeker-friendly type church, to downplay all that, to remove all that, to get rid of it. And seemingly those churches have grown and prospered and multiplied in a lot of ways, but I think I'm beginning to see it's not holding.
Exactly.
It's not lasting.
That's another one of the big issues, that when you're building the wrong way, it will not withstand the test.
Right.
Remember the seed that falls on shallow ground, it endures for a time, but then when persecution and trial come because of the word, it quickly fades.
Right.
Well, what if that persecution and trial don't come immediately? What if the testing doesn't come immediately? Yeah. So you may look like things are thriving, but if you're producing consumers rather than disciples,
right,
that's going to wane at a certain point. So that could be another reason for some of the drop-off. The churches that are filled with consumers are going to lose people, either when they try to take a stand for what's right or just the circumstances of life come in and test. But those that are producing disciples will grow and thrive in the midst of the storm.
What do you think about, is there a part to play with the internet world we live in? When children are raised, as millennials were, with with an iPod in their hand or a phone in their hand where everything they do is interactive, is there a part to play with the live streaming, Facebooking of television, of church services where people are like, you know what? I do university online. I do my shopping online. I do my Christmas shopping. I shop for clothes. I shop for food. Why not I shop for a church and then just do church in my house?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you'll have millennials that come to church services once a month and say, this is my church. Right. I'm committed. Right. So that's part of it for sure. And there's obviously a lot of good that comes through being able to reach people on the internet.
We do it every week.
I do it every moment of every day, obviously. At the same time, something is lacking relationally, interactively, when we're not face-to-face, when we're not getting to know each other in small groups, when we're not learning from each other and sharpening each other and helping each other. So the gathering together still is important. But that's part of it, the internet generation. Another part is they've been hit with a lot of stuff that no one's ever been hit with.
Right.
I didn't have to deal with pornography when I was a little boy.
Right.
It wasn't accessible to me when I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
I didn't get bombarded with certain shows putting out really bad values. So there's a bombardment that they're getting exposed to. And then, as Josh McDowell points out, that a lot of the objections that he was dealing with on college campuses, he's now running into with kids 12, 13 years old. Wow. Because they've just become memes. Yeah. They've just been processed down. And the problem is now a 12-year-old thinking through a difficult objection to the faith doesn't have the capacity, most of them, to fully digest and understand what the objection is, let alone hear an adequate response. Mm-hmm. You need to fight that meme with your own meme. Right. The world pushes an emotional button. You got to push an emotional button, to win, to get them to think and then present the truth to them. Right. So that's another challenge that we need to step up in our defense of the faith and our answering the tough questions and making it accessible to a younger generation and bring them into an encounter with God. The old Leonard Ravenhill saying, a man with an experience will never be at the mercy of a man with an argument. Right.
Well, we've tried, in seeing that, we have begun over the past 2 years to teach apologetics to our youth because the statistics are staggering. 70-something% of children lose their faith in the sophomore year or the freshman year of university. And we've got to stop that slide. And I think training the kids in the right way, not answering maybe in the way that the world would, but being able to stand our ground and not be wishy-washy is vitally important, at least in the day that we live in now. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, last bit we want to talk about. A 2008 article came out in Time magazine. They do this every year. It's called The 10 Things That Will Change the World, and they revisit these issues. In 2008, there was this magazine article came out, and there was something about global warming. There was something about solar energy or something. All these different things are supposed to change the world. According to this article, these 10 things would be more powerful than politics and more powerful than money. They would be seismic in their proportions. And number 10 on the list was the re-Judaizing of Jesus, making Jesus a Jew again. And as I began to read through the article and began to look at it, one thing it mentioned in there, it said that this of course, I don't think Time Magazine is a spirit-filled Christian publication, right. But for them to be able to grab a hold of a truth that so much of the church world has tried to either downplay, minimize, or completely ignore altogether, struck me as quite ironic. The last part of the article, it says that many Christians are hesitant to embrace Jesus as a Jew for the fear that they will lose their Christ. Right. And so I just want to get your viewpoint on that. Do you feel that it might be maybe not a true statement, at least it's a statement that is worth considering, and would it have an impact if we allowed that to happen, as seeing him as Jesus the Messiah as opposed to Jesus the Christ? I mean, just as I was witnessing to a Jewish man just a couple of years ago. We're having lunch together, and I was talking to him, but I kept referring to I would either say Yeshua, Jesus in Hebrew, and Messiah. But I never used the phrase or the word Christ. I always talk about Jesus Messiah. And he said, why are you calling him Messiah? And I said, well, because that's what he is. He said, well, why aren't you calling him Christ? And I said, well, Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. And the man literally thought that was Jesus' last name. He said, I thought that was his last name. I said, and I thought, have we been so poor at actually communicating the Jewishness of Jesus to the people to whom the gospel was originally communicated that we've shot ourselves in the foot? I mean, could you comment about this?
Yeah. Look, many Jewish believers I know, when they came to faith, they thought Jesus was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Christ.
This guy was one of them, yeah.
How would they know any better? And I was doing interviews on the street for a TV show I was doing years ago, and
Think It Through? Is that what it was?
Think It Through.
I love that, yeah.
Yeah, so I asked this couple of women, who is Jesus? They had a great answer. I said, what does Christ mean? And they didn't know. And some think, well, Christ is anointed, but then they don't think that anointed is Messiah.
Right.
Right. So there are a few things. If someone can accept that to the extent we can be biblical, we're stronger. That's all we're really saying.
Yeah.
We just want to be biblically accurate. We want biblical truth. We're not trying to turn Jesus into something that he wasn't, or turn all Christians into Jews, or saying you have to become a Jew to follow Jesus. Quite the contrary. But we are saying, let's understand who he really is. And when his identity is hijacked, so you can't even recognize him anymore, when so many of the things that would have been taken for granted as Jewish in a first century context are foreign to us, then we're obviously missing certain aspects of the story that are fundamental. And it's not to say the church hasn't had a lot of truth on that. It's that it's thrown out certain fundamental things along the way. So again, the pendulum swings, and you have like the Hebrew roots movement, and you're all going to be original tribes of Israel, and you have to use sacred names of the Lord, and you throw out maybe books of the New Testament, the most extreme parts. And then the other, which is you have to be so Christian that to acknowledge the Jewish roots of the faith, or to say Jesus was a rabbi, not a reverend. It's like, now you're a questioner, you're a Judaizer, you're questionable, And I see a lot of that. I see a lot of subtle and even overt anti-Semitism among many professing Christians today, when you just try to recover who Jesus Yeshua really was and is. But to me, it's a matter of recovering biblical truth, putting the New Testament writings in their historical context, understanding things the way the first century authors would have understood them. You want to do that with anything. Look, if you want to understand Shakespeare, and you thought William Shakespeare was an Italian who wrote in 1920, right? And this just translated into this Old English, you're not going to get him right. If you thought William Shakespeare was an American living after the Civil War, you're not going to get him right. Right, so to understand the English, the idiom, the cultural references, and just different things like that, anyone would know, okay, you have to do that. So on the one hand, there are timeless truths of the gospel that transcend culture and ethnicity and time. We understand that. But there are other things that are very much grounded in the culture of the day, in the values of the day and the Jewish understanding of the day, and even give us grounding with the biblical calendar and with various things like that. So why not have our foundations right? And if, in fact, Paul warns in Romans 11, warns Gentile believers against ignorance that leads to arrogance, thinking we are the new kids on the block, we have replaced Israel, God's through with the old Israel, we're the new Israel, and the danger of that, and it would lead to spiritually being cut off. And then you see so many great revival movements produced a heart for Israel as well, and a recognition of the importance of Israel. Look, you're not going to find a more Christ-centered preacher than Charles Spurgeon. But Spurgeon said, this is the 1800s, that there's nothing taught more plainly in the Bible, but that there's a physical future for the Jewish people back in the land. It's like a Spurgeon. So there's just something to a right connection with roots. And I know some pastors, megachurch pastors, that really felt the Lord challenged them about roots of the faith. And they started to recover things about the importance of family life. They started to recover things about even a Sabbath rest and the importance of that. They started to understand principles of divine order. And they say it's a key to their blessing and success. Not like a magic rock that you rub, this Jewish superstition, but rather recovering biblical roots. So to me, everybody should be part of every Christian should be part of a Back to the Bible movement. And Back to the Bible means the Bible in its historical, cultural context. And then from there, we make application to our day. So recovering the Jewish roots of our faith and the Jewishness of Jesus is just part of doing that.
And you feel that would have a transformative effect on the church?
Yeah, it's like getting another thing in place. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like if you have an exercise routine you're doing, but you're doing all your exercises in a wrong way, and someone says, here's the right way to do it. Well, you have to adjust, and it's uncomfortable, but then you get much more benefit from it. So it's just something else getting in its proper place, its proper perspective. And when that happens, these shifts are getting us more aligned with God's heart and God's mind, and therefore we should see positive change come.
You will know that the rabbis have a view of Messiah. Some of them have a dualistic view. They believe in two of them. One is the Mashiach ben Yosef, and one is the Mashiach ben David. And that's Messiah, son of David, and Messiah, son of Joseph. When I think about that idea and that concept, and I think about Messiah, son of Joseph, and why they would have that, when you think about the life of Joseph, which I think is quite interesting, you have Joseph, who is, when his brothers meet him, he doesn't look Jewish.
Yeah.
He doesn't even have a Jewish name. His name has changed, his identity has changed, where he's at's changed, his culture's changed, his nation's changed, and they don't recognize their brother. Would you see any prophetic picture in that for where we are today? Because we've changed his name from Yeshua to Jesus. We've changed his ethnicity from Jewish to Roman. We've changed his nationality from Israeli to American, or where we might be at. We've made him, we know we're supposed to be conformed into his image, but it seems like we've worked very hard to transform him into our image. And so it's lost that rooting. Would you see that?
Yeah, so I mean, Joseph becomes the savior of the Gentile world.
Yeah. Right,
unrecognized by his brothers, but the second time around, he reveals himself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I definitely see these parallels. You know, I've taught about them and things that God will do to open up truth to the Jewish people. Mm. Because look, you have medieval artwork, and Jesus looks like this very handsome Caucasian European, blonde hair, blue eyes, and the Pharisees, the rabbis, you know, these hook-nosed, evil-looking men. You know, so Jesus is anything but Jewish, and Jews are all evil.
Right.
Those are the stereotypes, and that's what a lot of Jews think, especially religious Jews. So I firmly believe that since Israel's salvation is of critical importance to God, the gospel going to the nations is of critical importance to God, and Israel's salvation is of critical importance. And Israel will not have a mass turning until Jesus the Jew is recovered.
Yes.
And that right within their own world, they recognize who he is, and then have the radical conversion and repentance and transformation. Mm-hmm. So since that's important to God, you better believe getting this right is life transformational, world transformational.
Excellent. Dr. Michael Brown, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Please share this video on all your social media and help us to spread the word. You can follow Dr. Brown at his Twitter, which is at Dr. Michael L. Brown. You can go to his website, which is askdrbrown.org. Are there any other platforms that you would want to?
Yeah, Facebook is also, that's ASKDR Brown, Ask Dr. Brown on Facebook. Same on YouTube, Ask Dr. Brown. If you go to the website, askdrbrown.org, you can connect with us on all those different platforms. And then when you're there, take 30 seconds, sign up for our weekly emails. This way you'll get lists of every article, every video that we put out. And we send you a real neat mini book, 7 Secrets of the Real Messiah.
Oh, super.
Yeah, an ebook.
Yeah, I want to get one of those.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.